Okay, everyone can see my screen and hear me okay, correct? Just give me a thumbs up. Great. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. We're so excited to be in community with you today as we present to you our closing session panel and reflection session for the Private Sector Climate Service Providers Academy, hosted by ASAP, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. Here is our agenda for today. We're going to do a brief orientation to what we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to hand it off to our panel moderator, Jim Fox. We'll have an outstanding panel for you today featuring a few folks from the private sector here to talk about their climate adaptation work. Then we'll have a break at 1:55. Afterwards, we'll invite you to partake in an activity with us where we're going to be reflecting on all that we've learned throughout the duration of the Academy. We're going to have a brief reflection from our Executive Director at ASAP, Deborah Butler. Then we'll have another short activity where we'll invite you to reflect on your continued learning from what you've learned over the course of the Academy, and then we'll do some wrap up at the end. My name is Maria Dozier. I'm the training specialist here at ASAP. I'm calling in from Ann Arbor, Michigan on the traditional lands of the Potawatomi, and my pronouns are she, they. Again, so excited to be in collaboration and community with you all today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our panel moderator, Jim Fox.
Thank you so much, Mia. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've attended these academies several years in the past, and this one is just equally excellent. So thank you very much for that. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jim Fox, a Senior Resilience Associate with Fernleaf. We're a small private company who offer resilient services and work with a lot of communities. Our kind of byline is from data to decisions, and we've been in existence for about the past 8 years. We're located in Asheville, North Carolina, the ancestral home of the Cherokee and Catawba. And with that, I'd like to introduce the panel and have them introduce themselves. So why don't we just go in the order that's here, and Shalini, why don't you go first?
Wonderful. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Mia. I'm Shalini Vachala, and I'm the Executive Director of Pre-Collective and the founder and CEO of Refocus Partners. And we design and finance and support communities in developing climate resilient infrastructure projects.
All right, John.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Phillips. I work for Parametrics. I'm the Director of Integrated Watershed Management in our Climate and Resiliency Group, and I lead a really strong team of adaptation experts here out in the Northwest, and we do work mostly on the West Coast. And I reside in the ancestral lands of the Salish, Coast Salish people.
And Tori.
Hi, everyone. Great to be with you today. My name is Tori Greaves, and I'm Director of Strategic Initiatives at S&P Global Sustainable One. Sustainable One is a unit within S&P Global, and we provide ESG data. Part of that is physical climate risk data and adaptation analytics. But we also cover a broader set of ESG ratings, nature data. It really covers a lot of different areas. And we serve internal customers, including the other divisions at S&P, for example, our ratings business and our indices business. And we also work with external clients. So I'll be excited to share more about all that with you today.
That's great. Yeah, so as we're starting to have our discussion as a panel, I would invite any of the attendees to be starting to drop any sort of questions that they have for the panel. We'll go through a little bit of a moderated discussion, and then we'll start reading out the questions you guys have left and having some conversations around those. So if things pop up, either type it in as a general question or even, direct it to one of the panelists as well too. So really to kind of start this discussion, since we do have a pretty varied bit of experience and expertise here on the panel, I'd like to start asking the panel, who are your main customers? Who are the people that pay you? And how does that differ from who your really main users and audiences are, if there is a difference? And so who wants to start on that one?
I'd be happy to start. Thanks, Jim. That's a good way to kick this off. So at Parametrics, we work both in the private and public sector. Our main customers on the public sector are municipalities that are working to look for options to make their systems more resilient. We do a lot of work on transportation. So we work with a lot of the DOTs in the states we serve. And then also everything from counties to major metropolitan areas to small cities. So kind of a diverse range. We also work a lot with the private sector, mostly industrials for like wastewater and meeting compliance, but also we do a lot of ESG work for other corporations that need to meet global and national goals for sustainability.
I'd be happy to jump in next. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I failed to mention I joined S&P 2 years ago through the acquisition of the Climate Service, which is a business that I helped, a startup that I helped sort of grow and develop since 2019, which is focused on climate risk analytics, and we have a software as a service solution. And it's been an interesting shift, I would say, in who our customers are since 2019 when I joined the Climate Service, and now through our work at S&P. At the beginning, at that time, it was really chief sustainability officers really trying to grapple with the TCFD and how to respond to that regulation, and sort of how to more check the box of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Now it's been a really interesting shift where we start the conversations primarily with chief financial officers, chief risk officers. There are also some chief sustainability officers in the mix, but sustainability and climate risk has been much more embedded into core business functions of risk management and financial planning. And that has been, I think, a really great thing for climate, and embedding this more into those core business functions. There's more budget for it. I think there's more sort of respect for this information and data as part of general planning processes. And I should also mention, we also cover transition risk data too. So part of our initial mission in starting the Climate Service was to try to embed climate data into financial decision making to promote a transition to an equitable transition to a low carbon economy. And just seeing this data get more and more embedded into those core risk functions and be embraced by sort of those chief executives within heads of business units, et cetera, has been a really positive shift, I think. In terms of our customers, we primarily, the vast majority of our business is with different private sector participants, whether those are large corporations, banks, asset owners. We work a lot with pension funds, for example. We have done a bit with government. So we've done some work, for example, with the Department of Defense, looking at different military operations and climate risk associated with those. But that's really just a minor part of our business. The core is really all across the private sector.
Yeah. How about you, Shalini?
Well, I love this question. I'm going to fold it together with one that's in the chat on what's my career path and what kind of brought us to this practice of this field as it's unfolding the way Tori described. And I'm an architect and an engineer by training, and I stumbled into climate resilience work largely by asking really simple questions of where and how our infrastructure serves us well and where it doesn't. And so Pre-Collective is a national nonprofit. Our partners and clients are generally folks who are dealing with issues that if I had to put a big umbrella around it, I would say they are things that are everybody's problem and nobody's specific job. So there's no single entity that's responsible for dealing with all the impacts of sea level rise, for example, or heat. And so we tend to work entirely on public interest infrastructure issues and projects. And we focus on the pre-development space, which is kind of a wonky term for all those early messy things you have to do when you're trying to do something you've never done before, or build something you didn't have. And so this is different than how do I repair my water treatment plant? This is how do I make my city stronger against flood risk? And so really that looks a lot more. My career path took me from early architecture practice to a DC think tank where I was doing economic and environmental policy, to the Obama administration where I was at EPA, working in international and tribal affairs. And in the process of trying to serve many, many different tribal nations, it was very clear that you had to zoom out to solve problems that were interconnected. And that, I think, was the beginning of our work in pre-development and resilience. So our core partners and clients are generally public entities who are struggling with something that they don't even know what to put in an RFP. So we are way upstream of traditional design and engineering contracts. And we often we are paid by local governments, by philanthropies interested in supporting kind of regional change or supporting grantees in a place-based way, and by corporate partners that are trying to deliver different solutions than they have necessarily traditional experience with. So something multi-benefit or cross-sectoral. And I think, Tori, where this connects to your work, we talk about 3 building blocks of pre-development. It's really vision, capacity, and funding. And everybody knows what happens when you're missing one of these. So if you have, vision and capacity and no money, you get gorgeous drawings, just beautiful, but nothing gets built. If you have capacity and money and no vision, you tend to get a spiffier version of what communities already have, right? The upgraded street, but not something transformational. And if you have vision and money and no capacity, which is a challenge for so many communities, you end up with really slow and uneven implementation and people exposed longer to various types of risks. So data and all the things Tori and John talked about are a big part of our work too.
That's great. And John, since Tori and Shalini talked a little bit about their path, how they get there, maybe you can fill in that blank for us right here now too.
Oh my gosh. I started out working in the public sector. I worked for King County Wastewater Treatment Division. It's kind of where I started right out of college. We sited a new regional wastewater treatment plant. And that was kind of the job I had for there. From there, I moved through the organization and was asked to work on climate change. About 2007 or so, they were looking for some folks to kind of start looking at data and how that might impact a regional wastewater system. So a lot of my work was in sea level rise, and then slowly transitioned into working more with precipitation. I don't think it was a traditional pathway. I was in the Navy for 6 years as well, where I actually did learn a little bit about climate change by going up into the Arctic Circle a few times. But other than that, it was just kind of serendipitous. Someone asked, and I said, sure, I'd like to work on climate change, understanding it, kind of knowing that it was an issue. It was going to be I felt like a big draw. And once I went to the private sector, my goal really was to move from kind of a big utility to be able to work with smaller communities, rural communities, even look at, how do we help community groups that are prepared for climate change, and had a really good discussion with our CEO before I joined. Wrote a strategic plan for the first 2 years I was here at Parametrics to kind of incorporate climate change in. We acquired a climate services group called Good Company out of Eugene, Oregon, and the group was established as the climate and ESG team within Parametrics to provide services across all the sectors we serve. So it took me 24 years to get here, just FYI. It's not a fast process. But I'm only 27, so I started when I was 3.
Well, I think even just from the beginning part of this conversation that at least from most people that I know in the adaptation field, there is no traditional path. I haven't seen any kind of you first do this, then you do that, and then you do the other. most of us have taken a very wandering path to get to where we're at. So I'm happy to hear that I have some fellow travelers with all of you. Why don't we talk a little bit about, since we've a lot of this academy has been about data and tools and how those are used. You know, what are some of the main data sources and mapping tools that you use? And are they public sources or are they internal ones? There's only 3 of us, so don't be shy. Just speak up. You don't need to wait for somebody else.
I'll start this one because I think I'm probably at the most general or the largest nesting doll, and Tori and John will be able to get more detailed. Our team, we really focus on designing infrastructure projects and solutions. So we use a pretty wide variety of data to understand needs and convert ideas into projects, right? So whether that's looking at who's at risk and from what types of hazards, and what kinds of solutions are available. A lot of times we're relying exclusively on public information. Sometimes we're working with, for example, insurance industry catastrophe models if we're trying to understand the answers at a rough cut to some really basic questions which drive our work. And the 2 questions I tend to ask most often that reveal what data sources we need to look for are, who loses money if we don't do this project? And who suffers? And so if you think about this in terms of like a good, clean example that I think everybody can relate to is, transit systems and heat. If you think about who loses money, often it's the system itself, right? You're running fewer trains, you're running them more slowly because tracks are melting in the least technical description of it all. And if you are thinking about who suffers, that's an elderly person. It's a transit dependent worker who's sitting outside longer on the hottest days of the year. If we are designing a solution for that problem, we're trying to keep those 2 sides of a solution together. And this goes to a question in chat on how do we think about equity in our work, which is, we think equity is at the center of everything. And if you are building infrastructure that doesn't serve people, you have designed a cathedral, not an effective public service. And that is, so it's a driving force in how we look for what data is going to be most useful and shaping a project that is community centered, but also delivers benefits for clear beneficiaries, not hand wave about general benefit. So, John, I think I might pass it to you because I suspect there's a seam there between our work.
There is. It's very true. So I feel lucky to be in the Northwest and working on climate adaptation because we have great resources through our public universities, Oregon State, Portland State, University of Washington, Washington State, and the University of Idaho. I think through my whole career path in climate, they have always been the biggest ally, the people that ask the questions to get data. And a lot of their data, obviously all their data is publicly accessible through via websites or something like that. And we use a lot of different, I would say, tools that they provide to look at like, okay, what data do we need for X, Y, or Z? But I would say more so than the tools are the researchers themselves. And establishing a great, strong relationship with the folks doing the science on climate change and be able to ask questions and then turn around and say, here's how we're using your data. And either they laugh at you or they say, oh, okay, great. Or no, I never thought of it that way. It's been really helpful. So that co-development of climate science has been kind of the forefront because when we first started working on climate change at King County, we had very little data and we kept asking for more. And they would work and say what's reasonable, what's feasible, how much does it cost to get that data, and of course, working for a large utility and having the impacts being so detrimental to infrastructure, the cost was far the cost of doing the research was much cheaper than the cost of trying to fix the problem later on down the road. And again, another kind of luck was the work with other large utilities like Seattle Public Utilities and the East Bay Municipal Utility District, San Francisco Public Utility. A lot of those, we all kind of started at the same time and we didn't have a lot of data and we worked with the data. The first thing we did was reached out to these climate scientists and said, this is the type of information we're looking for. But I think equity is a huge issue to grapple with equity and the amount of data and what data is being put forth and how accessible it is and how understandable it is and what tools are out there for people to understand it on their own home. I think some of the real estate apps you can download now, you can see how much, what the exposure is for a house you may buy. I mean, making that data accessible and very accessible is really important, but also to understand that there's a lot of biases incorporated into the data and understand what those biases are, whether you're looking at demographic data or you're looking at, census data, whatever that resource may be, is to understand that, nothing beats working with folks and going out and talking to people where they reside, where they live, where they work, where they hang out on a Saturday afternoon for a picnic or whatever. So not to lose sight that there's a human element to all this data. And then there's a human element to the impact of this data on people as well. And to make sure we're putting that forefront. It's really about people and not data. And we tend to kind of gloss over that when we do large maps. Or analysis is not. But I also think on the private sector side, just to kind of touch a little bit on how that data, a lot of the private companies are dealing with international issues. They have international supply chains. So, looking for data in other countries or in other parts of the world is also kind of important. And there's some resources out there that having kind of a global take on how things impact, say, Southeast Asia or, Central America is also important too. And that's where you really see the inequity and who has the data and who understands the impacts. And I'd really love to hear some of the other panelists talk about like the international aspect of it all. I mean, obviously global circulation models, do the whole globe. So you would think, oh, there's all this data, but to have regionalized data like we have in the Northwest where we understand like, how does that global weather pattern impact the Pacific Northwest with our unique, mountain ranges and lots of water and, the frost that we had this morning from the north.
Yeah, actually, that's a really great segue to our approach, John. We do ingest global circulation model data as the foundation of our software and analytics on physical risk. But we then take that, like we use CMIP6 data, for example, and we ingest that data, but then we have a team of scientists in-house who help translate that into specific hazard models, whether that's fluvial flooding or coastal flooding, tropical cyclone, wildfire, et cetera. So there's a lot that we do internally to then make that GCM data decision relevant for the types of analyses that we're trying to do. For us, though, the global aspect was really important because the investors and companies we work with all have essentially global footprints. And so in order for them to be able to understand the risk in an apples to apples comparison between different locations, it was important for us to develop this globally consistent methodology for that reason. It certainly poses challenges and kind of along the lines of the changes in customers that I mentioned earlier and clients and who's actually using our data. We've just seen a tremendous amount of sophistication among our clients over the last, even this year, I would say, where companies themselves, like if you think about a large food and beverage company, these companies are hiring their own climate scientists on staff to be able to translate this data into decision relevant information for those companies. So the questions that we're getting asked are increasingly granular and nuanced and really well informed. So we're now kind of taking our global models and mosaicing in more localized data to be able to get more granularity at a local level, but trying to maintain this sort of globally consistent basis. So for us, that's kind of the central key important part in terms of the data we use. And I think just circling back to the question about equity, it's interesting working from a perspective where you're really trying to kind of change a system, like working from providing data to the financial industry largely and private companies. It's a different lever in the system of change. You know, there are different levels and scales of change. And I think the sort of or the thing that I've always found empowering about providing essentially climate-related financial risk is really the output that we provide to companies and investors. So essentially, how much will you be impacted under different emission scenarios by the range of hazards we cover based on where your specific assets and investments are located? And that's always felt empowering because the numbers sort of speak for themselves largely. They never really look good. And that's important as well because right now there's just a whole host of climate risks, both on the physical risk side and transition risks that aren't priced into the global economy. And of course, a lot of that, you know, potential gain or loss is not felt by people on the ground, but when you're dealing with something like a pension fund, that is people's retirement. That is a person's savings for their livelihood. And we try to empower those fiduciaries to be making better choices based on how climate is going to unfold in the future. And also just really are helping to highlight that if we don't change as a global society and a global economy, if we don't decarbonize, the mounting costs of physical risk are going to continue to erode profits. And tying those connections together purely from a financial perspective, I think has been an empowering way to sort of not really change necessarily the hearts and minds, but change the bottom lines, or how a lot of private sector actors view climate change as more of not an ideological issue, but a real dollars and cents issue. So it's a different sort of lever within the system, but myself, and that's the scale that we're trying to act within, and just let the data really speak for itself and try to just produce the most robust analytics that we can.
Wow, I love all three of your answers because all of you migrated from kind of the data and tools to the types of services that you're providing. Tori, even in your opening comments, you talked about your company, you know, having software as a service, SaaS solutions and things. And so I'd like to open that up a little bit more because I think the people that are attending here really want to hear a little bit more about this. Is, you know, how do you convert all of this complexity, this data, your models, everything else, into usable and useful information that decision makers and others really value? And each of you have already started to answer that question. So I'd just like you to think about how do you open that box a little bit more, maybe give another example or case study.
I'll try to jump in on this one first, but maybe we can go back and forth, John and Tori. I spend a lot of time trying to reduce the intimidation factor of using robust data and really distill it down into what do you need for decision making. And I think that comes down to a key facet of adaptation that sets it apart from, climate mitigation, for example, which is that success a lot of times when we do our work really well in the public or the private sector is something that doesn't happen. The storm hit, but the community wasn't flooded. And so data is incredibly important to be able to show the value of that counterfactual, but even more importantly, to lock it in upfront. And so I tend to speak in a lot of metaphors behind which there are reams of information. And the three examples that I use the most often are really thinking about climate change adaptation like preventative healthcare. Where we've done this well, you actually have a lot of quantitative modeling and actuaries who can say, if you quit smoking, here's what this does for you individually and for the population at large. But if you say, I'm going to the gym, we don't have good information about what that does. So a lot of times I'm taking stories and metaphor from different sectors that people might feel closer to or less intimidated by or have them more personally relevant to be able to translate climate data into decisions. Do I want to keep supporting a sandbag program in my city? or should I actually deal with the shoreline differently? And so that's, I think that's an exercise in sometimes what I cheekily call English to English translation. But it really comes down to needing to be able to make this case for a success that you don't see at the end of the day.
Yeah, and maybe you could just open that up a little bit more, because last week you shared the Hoboken story a little bit, and I dug into it on your website. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
For sure. So this is one of my favorite things. I don't know how many folks in the audience have spent any time in the city of Hoboken. It's a wonderful little postage stamp across the river from Manhattan in New Jersey. And Hoboken was absolutely leveled just by, sorry, y'all. Can you hear me again, Jim?
Yes.
Okay. Hoboken was just crushed by Hurricane Sandy. They had, over 10 feet of standing water, multiple weeks of power and water disruptions. And we worked with the city shortly after the floodwaters receded. And the city was really keenly looking to improve its resilience, but considering things like pumps for flooding. And so we did a set of design exercises with them, supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, as part of a cohort of cities looking to build resilient solutions. And what we developed for Hoboken was some very early stage conceptual design on, could we create a bathtub? We used parking facilities, for example, to flood from the bottom up and create stormwater retention and detention facilities. So the kinds of data we needed were, what doesn't happen? Well, the hospital doesn't have the sewer system underneath it explode. The water treatment plant wouldn't you wouldn't have combined sewer overflows. And so a lot of this was information about avoided cost in what we were doing and for different beneficiaries. So across the course of 10 years, I'm going to flatten this out, of pre-development. Think of this like a relay to 6-acre plot. We helped them with the first stages of funding and financing the project. And they now have this gorgeous 6-acre park that is like a layer cake of bathtubs and sponges with recreational facilities and green space in a city that had hardly any. And they were able to build this project. It opened this past summer, and the city experienced really dramatic rainfall in September, or recently. And the New York Times sent out news crews, a bunch of news organizations did, to document the flooding, because Hoboken always flooded. And the city didn't. The project captured over 1 million gallons of storm water from the rain event. And the city was back up and running within 24 hours after an event that should have shut them down for weeks, typically. And so what was great about it is the news story that came out actually reported the story of what didn't happen, which was just such a lovely shout out for the value of climate data, but also what climate action looks like when it's successful.
Yeah, and I love that story, because we so rarely hear the stories of the action that was taken and then the success of it. And I just kind of want to build on that. And John, don't mean to put you on the spot, but I mean, so many of us have gone to school off of the pioneering work that King County did, and you guys now continue to follow through with your company. Could you maybe talk a little bit about some of those successes that you've had of taking action and serving as a national leader for people to be following you on that as well too?
Yeah, I think I don't think there's a solid trick to it. I think it's an investment, right? And looking at some of the questions or discussions in the comments and thinking about, okay, who's making the investment and who benefits from it, right? And you could say, well, if a utility makes an investment to make sure that their pump station is resilient to climate change, that it's not going to flood under an extreme tide event. And that was one of the first places we focused on, was sea level rise and how it impacted the hydraulics of the system. We found a lot of information out, and it wasn't really from the data. It was just kind of asking the questions from a different perspective of how and where does this happen, and what does it do to the facility we're responsible for, but also that facility is in a community. It's in a neighborhood, it might be located in a park, it's definitely on the shoreline. So whether it was successful or not remains to be seen. We have to wait till 2080 or 2070, and I'm not going to be around. So all the more power to say, yeah, let's go do something about it. The success in the short term is we see less of this infiltration into the saltwater infiltrated into the sewer system. And at the same time, we noticed that there are other issues, right? There's overland flooding of parks. There's overland flooding of trails and roads in that same area. So on the long-term scale of things is what is also needed to make that community more resilient, because the utility doesn't exist without the community. So you have to think back to the terms of, who are the main customers of that facility, and it's the people that live around it. And we were asked a question like, what would you do if this area flooded? How would you move it up the hill or something like that? And it's like, well, we wouldn't need that if we had to move that community up the hill. We'd have a whole new sewer system put in. The community would have to migrate to make themselves resilient. So the need for that one facility isn't there anymore. It's because there's nobody there to use it. There's no homes, there's no businesses to do it to it. And I see that a little bit in the private sector, because no one can exist within an area and produce something without the support of the community. You need people to drive things. You need workers to come in and harvest. You need all the infrastructure for moving goods and materials out of your field if you're a farmer, and what your crop is, and how that is resilient to climate change, and how well will it do in frost, and how well will it do in heavy rains and extreme heat, and how much water are you using. And you're dependent on your community for water as well, but you're also dependent on the fact that you can't overuse the water, right? So you see a lot of those questions being asked in the supply chains discussion, right? Down to the smallest component, even on say a computer or a laptop. Where is that component made, and who is making it? And what investments need to be made so that that particular factory still exists? And is it sustainable, and sustainable in a very broad sense? Like, what kind of labor do they have? What kind of labor are they using? And I've talked to a few of our sustainability folks on the private side, and want to bring that kind of to the public side because of their kind of questions they're asking, right? If you have this piece of equipment that's made all over the world and then assembled in the United States, where are all those components coming from, and how do they get to the United States? How do they get to that one factory? And then how does it get from that factory into production and put into something? So to kind of ask those questions as well. All those things, baseline is you have to have the roads, you have to have the trails, rails, not trails. You need trails too, but you also need rails to get things from point A to point B. And all that has to be built on resiliency. And I see that like in my personal life, I'm able to walk to the Puget Sound, and every time I walk to Puget Sound, I have to walk over railroad tracks, right? There's railroad tracks right along the edge of Puget Sound. They haul everything from airplanes to lumber. The lumber comes out of Canada. The other thing it hauls, and I always make this point, is it hauls coal, and hundreds of coal trains going north to Canada as the timber comes down. So not from a mitigation perspective, but just thinking about that whole supply chain and what's happening right there in front of you, of what goes on. And that's kind of a sidebar, but I always have to bring that in. There's still coal being moved around. But I also see like the private sector makes, and I think Tori kind of would be the person to touch on this even more, is when I worked for a public utility, we did a financial disclosure and climate risk document once a year that was handed over to the investors, because the public sector, most of the public sector will build projects with municipal bonds. And in the municipal bond markets where the big money comes from to build the big infrastructure projects. And then you take that to another tier where you say, okay, well, that's the municipal bond, that's paying for this. And then who benefits and what's being paid for is then the venture capitalists that are interested and want to invest in, either nature-based solutions or adaptation, because taking it back a step, that capital might be coming from place where they produce a product and they're relying on that community to produce that product, or relying on that community to bring workers in to actually program that.
Okay. Yeah, Tori, he kind of referred to some of your work in that. Do you want to make any comments on this one before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, sure. I guess just kind of, yeah, maybe tying together some threads and also thinking back to your original question, Jim, of sort of how do we know, how do you develop information that's useful? I think in the world of climate data, climate analytics, providing these services, what I found is it's always really important to clarify to clients what you do and what you don't do. And actually, this goes back to some of the comments I think John was also making about the importance of local communities and sort of local knowledge. At the global scale, or how we view our work, is really as what we articulate as a climate risk screen. So if you have a global portfolio, you don't have the luxury of having paying for a site assessment at every single one of your thousands of locations around the world. But data like ours can help you get a picture of what that information is, and where you might have hotspots of risk. Then you need to bring in the local knowledge to actually think about validating that risk, making a plan to mitigate it, et cetera. So that's always what's guided us in terms of how we design our financial risk metrics that we provide, who's using them, what are the use cases for them. And it's different if you're a real estate investor or if you're a company concerned about your supply chain and how much risk you might be holding in your supply chain. If you're an investor in municipal bonds, that's a different kind of analysis, and you care about things like probability of default and other metrics. So really tying the outputs to the use cases has always been important. But also, I think something that we actually come up against increasingly now is clarifying which hazards we can model with confidence that are climate related and which we can't. That's something that comes up quite a bit. So we get asked all the time about seismic risk. The linkage between earthquakes and climate is really much less established than something like drought. We have to be really careful in how we guide our clients towards the questions we can answer and can't answer, and also what purposes our analytics that we provide are useful for versus not, like something that you would need an on-the-ground engineering analysis to validate versus this higher level screening analysis. Yeah, so there are a lot of different layers and I think complexities there, but we always try to lead with what is going to be most decision useful for our clients and what do we have the greatest confidence that we can provide. And then we partner with a lot of people for the things that we don't do.
Well, I love the word that you just used, so I'm going to kind of switch up the order with a couple of these questions we're going to talk about, because there's been several that have come into the chat. Let's talk a little bit about partnerships and kind of your partnership models. And there was a couple questions early on about what sorts of public-private partnerships can each of you point to in your work, and what types of partnerships do you see on the horizon? So anybody want to start talking about some of the partnerships you're using right now and kind of an example of that and how you see some of that changing maybe?
I can kick off going back to that Hoboken example, which was an interesting philanthropy, private and public partnership where we coordinated a group that included, Bechtel Engineering, a set of private sector law firms, folks who knew structured finance, kind of reformed investment bankers, and put together SWAT teams to serve cities with philanthropic funding. So that's one example of a type of partnership. And I will say, going to Josh Foster has a bunch of great comments and questions just unfurling in the chat here. So I'll try to touch on a few of them, Josh, but happy to follow up. I think one of the challenges that we hit in that Hoboken project that really startled us very early in our work was that there's a whole bunch of public money sloshing around that's not being well used for adaptation and resilience investments. And private money is rarely going to be public money. And so we gave the city two options of financing this parking garage bathtub, where we were using essentially parking fees to cross-subsidize flood risk mitigation. And what we did is we put together two options. You could run this as a P3 with a private entity managing a parking facility, paying for essentially water utility investments. And then we said, well, what if we used EPA state revolving loan funds, FEMA money, and we were able to layer public funds up in a way that the private sector could get to almost like 2% interest, which was basically nothing at that time for a project of that scale, $100 million. And the public sector money, had 20% loan forgiveness on the EPA water dollars, clean water dollars. So in a lot of spaces where we have pushed on public-private partnerships for financing, there are often cheaper, underutilized public solutions in our world, or cost savings that aren't being tapped. I think in the broader perspective, I'll talk about something we're trying to figure out now. In Kansas City, which has been one of our favorite partner regions. And we've been increasingly, our team at Pre-Collective, or I'll speak for myself, I have been increasingly frustrated with private investment flowing into apps, not assets. And so the difference between a scooter on a sidewalk and a transportation system retrofit or a water system retrofit is miles apart for a venture capitalist. And I think this is less about climate data and more about finance short-termism. How do I get my exit and how do I do it quickly in an industry where you need 5, 10 years to see system change or results? And so I think we have incentives that tilt us toward temporary solutions or surface solutions rather than deep structural changes. And so we're experimenting now with partners in Kansas City and across the country on, can we take typical business improvement districts or BIDs and really create spaces that are climate improvement districts? So instead of just focusing on property tax and tax-based growth, look at risk reductions and emissions reductions as benefits of these different districts. And so it's sort of a funny governance entry point to public-private partnership in a way that solves a problem for each individual sector and actor. The public sector doesn't want to play whack-a-mole on scooter by scooter technology solutions. The private sector doesn't want to spend 3 to 5 years talking to the same folks who are getting handed off across 5 different government agencies. And so can we facilitate more streamlined investments in real climate assets and technology innovations and shorten the sales cycle across cities rather than having these be one-off painful business to government transactions? So some that's worked, some that hasn't, and some that we're experimenting with in the space on partnerships.
I just wanted to quickly maybe chime in on a +1 on the frustration of investor short-termism, something we really struggle with in communicating climate risk to a lot of our clients. And we certainly don't have it solved, but a couple things or strategies have, I think, helped. One is some pushback we get with our analytics sometimes is, why do you all provide data and projections out to 2100? No investor cares what's going to happen in 2100. And while that might be true, a lot of hazards, for particularly coastal flooding as one example, aren't linear in how they're projected to change over time. Around, in the next 20 years, for example, some hazards are projected to increase sharply, more exponentially than sort of the moderate increases that we've seen over the last couple of decades. And I think providing that data, even if it's not going to be immediately used or even met with skepticism, at least providing a perspective that even though you might not be seeing a large financial impact this year, next year, in 5 years, if you're planning to hold on to this asset, as many real estate investors, for example, are for 10, 15 years, or if you think about some of those pension funds, longer term investors, like they will be holding assets for a longer term. Providing that longer range data and showing that now, I think does help psychologically reinforce the urgency of taking action now and making changes now. I think it's a journey. We've had some successes with that with some clients that we work with. And I know we'll touch on insurance later, but I think this is what we're starting to see more in the reinsurance industry, which is helping to influence the insurance industry. So there are some positive changes there, but I just wanted to, yeah, plus one on that, Shalini. I think that's a huge short-termism just generally in the global economy is a huge challenge to working on climate change. And sometimes I think that's the work that we should all be working on in tandem.
Yeah, so we only have about 3 minutes left, believe it or not, for the panel. So I did want to give each of you about a minute to talk about what are some of the current changes that are happening. Talk about the insurance market or some of this new availability of government funding. How is that changing your business model or providing new opportunities? And so if you could just be pretty brief, but each of you just kind of talk about that.
I can start. The amount of money out there for infrastructure investments it's unprecedented in history that we've had this much money for infrastructure investment. The state of Washington has started its Cap and Invest program, and however people may feel about that, there's millions, if not billions of dollars being directed towards climate mitigation and adaptation in the state of Washington, more than can be spent. I would say that right off the bat. And that's the thing is, as an industry, as adaptation professionals, we need to think about the generations to come that need to be here to help move these projects forward. But I did want to touch a little bit on the public-private partnership before we left that I've seen really successful ones in the stormwater nature-based solutions for stormwater treatment and management, where public-private partnerships are almost routine now, where it was kind of a mix of, pilots and experiments, but now it's almost routine that you'll see public-private partnerships, having other people invest in stormwater to mitigate stormwater in communities, including the private sector. And I see a lot of private sector investment happening in Seattle in stormwater and nature-based solutions. But, the big picture of this all is that, yes, there's a lot of money. We knew it was coming. We tried to gear up as much as we could. But we find now that, partnering with just anyone we can find to help and partner with and making use of our relationships to figure out which projects are out there. I mean, there's enough work to go around for the private sector on this. And I think it'll just grow. And I kind of feel like it's going to go on and on for a very long time.
Okay. Very quick closing comments, either Shalini or Tori.
I will just say that I'm wildly optimistic, right? I mean, to John's point, we have more money than Roosevelt did to remake our infrastructure, and people are actually getting more sophisticated thinking about climate issues. So now it's really about translating that to the doing. And so I'm really excited that all of you are in this conversation and with sleeves rolled up together at the Academy.
Tori?
Likewise, it's just great to have been with you all today and to join the panelists. I think there's so much to say about insurance and climate risk, but I think we're seeing a lot of positive change. For example, I think even several years ago, only catastrophe risk models, backward-looking catastrophe risk models were used in pricing insurance. And now we partner with insurance companies to blend climate models with catastrophe risk models to price in more of the forward-looking risk. So just as Shalini said, I think there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful that there's a lot of positive change happening.
Well, thanks to all three of you for being part of this conversation. I wish we had a lot more time. Hopefully we covered a lot of the questions that people were also posing to us. We are going to capture these questions and all, and they'll be available to us. And we'll try to be answering those as time goes on as well, too. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mia and let us continue on. Once again, thanks to all of you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to all of our amazing panelists. I took so many nuggets of information and hope from that conversation. Also, thank you to all of our participants who have been having a fantastic conversation in the chat. Now we're going to move to about a 10-minute break, and I'll come back together about 2:05 or 5 past the hour, wherever you are. And once we rejoin, we're going to have an opportunity to talk about all that we've heard today and throughout the course of the Academy in small groups. So get excited for that, and we'll see you all back here in about 10 minutes. Okay, great. So we're going to go ahead and get started now. Thank you all for your full attention as we come back together and go into the next section of this Academy session. The next thing we're going to be facilitating with you all is a break-in activity where you'll be thinking and reflecting upon what you've learned in the Academy via your organization and the services that you provide in your lived experiences. So for this activity, we're actually going to divide you all up by organization type. So in just a second here, Megan is going to open up breakout rooms, and it's going to be a little bit different this time. Instead of you automatically being assigned to a breakout room and you just press join breakout room, you'll see these 3 options pop up, and you can self-assign yourself to whichever one best makes sense for you. So the 3 organization types are sole proprietorships. Essentially, you working solo for your own business is usually just you. Second is small, medium organizations. Work for a small to medium nonprofit or a company. This is where you would go. And the third organization type are any primes or large organizations that are usually in the private sector, or you're just like one facet of a large company. So those are our 3 organizational types, and you'll be answering different questions depending on the type of organization that you belong to. If anybody has questions about this activity or is confused about how to get to their assigned breakout room or self-assign themselves to a breakout room, please let us know in the chat, and we can help direct you there. But Megan, are you ready to open the breakout rooms? Great. So we're going to have a facilitator for each of these. It's going to be Jim, Eliza, and I. And we're going to hop into each of these breakout rooms to help facilitate those questions for you. So you're not alone. And we'll see you in there. Hello, everyone. I know some of you might have gotten cut off in your conversations. We're sorry about that, but super happy that you all were able to at least briefly talk to each other about the ideas that we've hinted towards in this academy. With that, soon we'll be transitioning into a couple of reflections from our executive director, Deborah Butler, at ASAP, and we're really excited to hear from her. But first, I'd love to hear if any of you have any self-reflections that you mentioned during your breakout room, or anything that someone else said that really stood out to you. Feel free to use the raise hand or just unmute yourself. You know, I was telling my group, one of my favorite parts of being an educator is actually the awkward silence when you ask a question, because you get to see who in the room that will embolden or spark creativity in to rise and answer the question. And you can kind of see the wheels turning as that happens. Jim, how about you? Did you hear anything in your group that stood out to you?
Well, I think the continuing theme of, how do we better utilize partnerships to get, individuals or small companies to have access, you know, to more contracted work and all as well too. It's a theme we've heard in the private sector. It's one that we're hearing here today too. So I think it's one of those things that ASAP as an organization could really help support our members by providing some more models in that regard. And in fact, it's going to be a conversation we're going to have at our December private sector meeting. So.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Eliza, do you have anything from your group that stood out to you?
Yeah. A lot of themes. I think one that resonates is just that this work is difficult, and being able to connect in this way, and connect, knowledge-wise, but also just connect with shared stories, and creating that community, though we are, not in the same place at all. I think that was something that I heard in my group.
Great, thanks. Does anybody from those groups want to expand at all upon what Jim or Eliza has shared?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I'm Carlos Von Arek. I was in the sole proprietors group, and I agree with the idea of partnerships as being so important, especially for small businesses, sole proprietors. This has helped me in that respect for my business to be able to have the increased chances of expanding in terms of work for my business and providing the services that my business has available. And also the tools, besides the partnerships that I can see being enhanced by this Academy program, also the tools from the different CAPRISA teams, that was very helpful. I'm based in Connecticut, and all the region's tools are going to be very helpful, I think, in some way, but particularly the Northeast region. So those tools are going to be very helpful to help me to provide services in terms of climate data. I work with communities in underserved and disadvantaged communities, and so providing that climate data so they can focus on what they need to do in those communities to build resilience, help build up their infrastructure to prepare for increasing intensity of climate events in years, decades ahead, and getting the funding they need. I'd like to work more on assisting those communities obtaining the funding they need to build a resilience. And so those tools in my case will help as well as the partnerships, because that's going to go a long way in those goals I have for my business to continue to provide services.
Thank you so much, Carlo. So it looks like Deborah isn't here just yet. The good thing is we have one more reflection activity for you all, where you're going to be returning back to those breakout rooms that we can do in the interim. So you're going to be answering just 2 brief questions. What are you taking away from the Academy? I suppose it's 3. We've kind of lumped the first 2 into one, but what are you taking away from the Academy? What are you excited about? And if you have any feedback about what we should change for next year's Academy, we would love to hear that as well. So while we're waiting, we'll go ahead and transition to those breakout rooms, and when we come back, we'll hear from Deborah. Hey, perfect. Well, thank you all for that feedback and joining that pretty quick breakout session. We're so delighted to be joined today by ASAP's Executive Director, Deborah Butler, who's just going to share with us a few reflections on the Academy and its application. So thank you so much, Deborah, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Mia, and hello to everyone. I just want to begin by saying I am so pleased to meet all of you once again. I was at the very first meeting, and I'm very excited that you chose to spend so much time with us. I also want to thank you individually and collectively for taking the time to come together to learn and to share, and to help us with our work. It's very important that we learn together and that we learn from you, as well as our wonderful speakers, and all the engagement that you've had over the past 6 weeks. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're enormously grateful to have you as part of our family. I also want to thank Jim Fox for his very elegant handling of our panels and being moderator for us. He has extensive experience in both modeling and in working to translate science, the tools of science, into a way to make decisions for humans and for ecologies. That's very difficult work, particularly when scientists are caught up in tools, but we know that tools, right, are utilities to help us in answering questions. One of the most significant research instructors that I had when I was in grad school was an Indigenous woman who said that part of doing the science is knowing how to ask the right questions. And so I hope that this academy has helped you develop the skills to ask the right questions and to remember that a question is always wrapped in intention. First of all, who did we include and who did we omit in the question? Why is the question important? And who will or should the outcome benefit? And so as you go about your work in the private sector, please keep that question of questions in mind and remember that whatever the work is that you go forward with should benefit us all. I want to thank Dr. Vajhala for her remarks and for being with us today. I would like to thank John Phillips for being here as well. Both of them have been in climate justice and resilience work for a very long time, and we appreciate their expertise and their willingness to share with us today. I'd also like to thank Tori Greaves for her very insightful information on risk, the credit markets, and private equity, because we know that the private sector will be the driver going forward for a lot of the work that we have to do. So thank you very much for being here with us and sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. As we go forward, I'd like to encourage you to stay connected with us. I'd like to remind you that if you aren't already an ASAP member, you should be, so please join us. I'd also like to remind you that we all are committed to transformational change in our workspaces, in our communities, in our towns, in our ranches, in our churches, and in our families. I also want to remind you that we are all committed to equitable climate futures going forward, particularly through the climate sector. And I want to remind you that we need you, that we need each other. So please stay connected. And thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for those reflections. Before we close out, I'd also like to open it up to any other Academy speakers who are present. If you are here today, first of all, we just want to extend so much gratitude to you for presenting and sharing with us during the duration of the Academy. And you have the floor if you would like to share anything as we round out the end of the closing session. Do you have any presenters with us today? So that's okay. We'll just go ahead and wrap up the session now then. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen just one more time. This slideshow. Once again, thank you all so much for connecting with us. As Deborah said, we hope that this is not the last time that we get to connect with you and that you join ASAP as either an individual or organizational member. We invite you to also sign up for a one-on-one consultation with our presenters from the regional sessions, the opening and principal session, as well as the closing session. Connect with us on Slack and the rest of the participants as well. And then also, please fill out our assessment form for your official Climate Service Providers Academy certificate. We'll be using that form to help us collect information and distribute their certificates appropriately. So that link should be coming around in the chat. And with that, thank you all so much for attending our 2023 Climate Service Providers Academy. It's been such an honor to be able to organize this academy and MC and put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this, along with my colleagues at ASAP, as well as Jim and our presenter. So just thank you all so much. And with that, we'll be signing off. Have a good afternoon, everyone.